Hello there, my name's Colin Sterling and I am one of the organisers of the Design and Ideas competition Reimagining Museums for Climate Action. And as part of the competition, we are making available a few short conversations that explore some of the main themes and ideas driving the project. And today I'm delighted to be speaking with Dr. Jenny Newell, Manager of Climate Change Projects at the Australian Museum, where she works on increasing public engagement in climate solutions locally and internationally through the medium of museums. And Jenny also leads on runs the Museums and Climate Change Network. So I'm very grateful to you for joining us today, Jenny. Really pleased that you're able to give us this time. You're in Sydney, I'm in London, big time difference, but you know, we're able to have this conversation in times of COVID, and that's absolutely fantastic.
Hi, thanks Colin, and thanks everyone for joining. I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm speaking from the land of the Darug people, which is part of the Eora Nation, and this is land that has never been ceded, and I really appreciate the great custodianship of this country that has gone on for 60,000 years, of which we are the benefactors. And I'd also like to acknowledge that we try and honour that work through what we're doing at the museum. So yeah, it's great to be able to join you, all of you who are thinking about museums in this new and exciting way, this really important new way, and trying to reimagine what we do as museum professionals.
Thanks, Jenny. That's wonderful. I should say I sent across Jenny quite a few conversation topics that I wanted to cover in this short conversation. We probably won't be able to get to all of those at all, but I wanted to start off by asking, what exactly does the role of Manager of Climate Change Projects entail at the Australian Museum? Because I think it's quite an unusual title for someone to have. Well, perhaps it's less unusual these days, I don't know, maybe it's becoming more common, but how does it differ from a kind of curatorial position? And how have you seen this conversation around climate change evolve over the past 2 decades that I know you've been involved in this kind of work?
Yeah, thanks, good questions. So Manager of Climate Change Projects means that I'm really working hard to make sure that the audiences we have can understand and engage in climate change more effectively. And so we're doing lots of gathering together what it is that we're understanding about climate change through our work at the museum, through what the scientists are doing. We don't have climate scientists, but we do have people who work on biodiversity and tracking the impacts of climate change on biodiversity in Australia and the Pacific. And also our cultural collections teams and all that they can contribute to these conversations, and really designing effective ways of engaging the public in this really important set of new understandings about our changing environment and how they can get involved and what they can do about it. We really want to help people understand the solutions to runaway climate change. And so it is a curatorial role in lots of ways. I mean, I've got a small collection of my own, but I also can draw on the collections across the museum. And we design events and exhibitions and workshops and all sorts of things. We're trying to be more and more creative as we go on, as we learn more and more about how to connect to people more effectively around these difficult issues. And I think it is an unusual role. The museum's pretty, I guess we're pretty innovative. We're really fortunate that our CEO and director, Kim McKay, has long been really committed to these issues and just wants to make sure we're making a big difference and that we're taking action. There are a few other curators who are curators of the Anthropocene or curators who work on climate change in other museums around the world. And that's been something that has occurred just in the last few years. So I guess I started working on climate change myself through my earlier curatorial roles, working with Pacific collections and Pacific communities. And I'd heard from those Pacific communities that climate change was this increasingly critical and existential issue for them. And it just, I was trained as an environmental historian, but it became increasingly apparent to me that I really couldn't work in the past anymore. I really needed to work in the here and now, and that climate change was the thing that I really had to try and help Pacific voices to be heard in the places I was working in London, New York and Canberra and Sydney. And so I just, I guess I've been working in this place, in this sort of space for a while, but feeling a little bit alone, I've got to say. So it's been great to see this. I guess it's not quite an upsurge yet. It's the start of an upsurge, I think, of museums really stepping up to appointing people to work full-time on climate change and the Anthropocene, and these ways that we can help our audiences understand how much we need to recognise that we're part of nature, we need to care for nature.
I mean, one of the key things, it seems to me, across a lot of those different roles has been drawing together the fact that museums are dealing with these vast collections of historical objects with their traditional role of educating and bringing in different publics to understand these objects. But then you know, over the past 30, 40 years, museums have become much more activist, much more public facing, much more open to acknowledging their own agendas, shall we say, in some contexts, not everywhere.
Yes.
But this shift towards saying, okay, there is this huge environmental, societal, political issue of climate change that is affecting different communities around the globe in so many different ways. How exactly can museums even begin to address that? And what's been really exciting to me is this idea that there are so many different places around the world starting to do this. How do you see the kind of role of your objects and collections in particular in the museum that you're currently involved with? And I know previously you were at the British Museum and the American Museum of Natural History, is that correct? Yeah,
yes,
so,
right. Yeah.
how do you see the kind of differences between those three different collections and environments that you cared for and worked with in terms of relating to climate change?
Yeah, thanks. And I should also mention, I also was at the National Museum of Australia in Canberra for a while as well. So thinking about, these many disparate collections. I think in any collection, any museum collection, it's an incredible storehouse of stories, and the great power of objects. And there's many powers that objects have, but I think the central one for me is that they're like lodestones, and they really pull in these stories. They pull in people. They pull in stories all around them, and so you can get, when you have like a community group coming in to visit some important ancestral objects, you can get this lovely cross-generational set of conversations around those objects, and the things that are shared, then the things that are pulled out and that are remembered, and the sort of that visceral kind of recollection of feelings and sounds and smells, even all these associations of really significant times and places and people all sort of come out, and they're all shared with everyone else there in the room. And there's those sorts of moments are incredibly powerful and often very emotional for the people there in the room. How we translate that kind of sharing to a broader audience out in a museum, in a case, or in any way that we would normally share stories, is, I think, the challenge that museums will always have. And I think what's really lovely is seeing those occasions when objects are brought out and shared on a table, or in a more open kind of way, without the glass in the way and so on, and that the people are able to really speak to a specific object, and you can get these lovely cross-cultural connections happening, and sudden leaps of understanding that people might not have had before. And it can happen with not just cultural objects. It can be a bird specimen, a bird that's now extinct in an island that someone's able to speak about, and really open up whole new vistas for the listener. It can be, was a beautiful thing happened once when we had, so in our museum, for instance, we have there's a bag made out of hepa seeds from, it's a Tongan bag, and we were visited by a member of the royal family from Tonga, Lady Fei Lakepa, I want to say that right, and she held it up and she said, "These seeds don't exist in Tonga anymore. It's things have changed there so much that I think maybe it's too hot. And so they're not able to get those seeds anymore, but they're able to see these bags and see them as a special possession of the past, and have that recognition that we need something new to take its place. We need to be thinking about what we've lost and the implications of that, and what we might do going forward to make sure we don't keep losing these special parts of our world. And I think museums can tell those kinds of stories. There's lots of really lovely examples, actually, of even just videos being used with people telling that kind of story on a website. Is actually, it can still make huge connections, and people can have all sorts of realizations. And one of the things we've got a new climate change exhibition, which is opening up when we reopen in October. We've just had a large renovation at the Australian Museum, and we've in this gallery we're talking about, it's called Changing Climate. It's all about climate change in Australia, and we asked several people who we were working with to help us understand the impacts of climate change in Australia. We spoke to people working on coral reefs, and we spoke to farmers, and we spoke to doctors, and so one of the doctors, Dr. Kim Liu, who works in Western Sydney, talked to us about the impacts of climate change. And we asked her to give us an object, and she said, well, I'd like to give you my pediatric stethoscope. And that's because this is through this stethoscope, I hear the impacts of fossil fuel pollution on the lungs and the hearts of the young people in Western Sydney. And she said this kind of pollution, burning fossil fuels, has the biggest impact on the young and the old. And so it's through this object that she has traced this change over time, actually, the increasing numbers of kids with heart and lung issues, and with the amount of heat that's now being generated in particularly Western Sydney. It's getting incredibly extreme. Like, they reached 50 degrees centigrade in January this year. I mean, it's just staggering. And so more people died of the heat wave before the bushfires than in the bushfires themselves. And she just sees that this object really sums up for her the impacts she sees now, but the ones she's going to be seeing even more into the future. Yeah, and it was, so we've got that in a little case in the exhibition, along with other things which people donated to us. And it's often really heartfelt stories, which are really hard sometimes for the people to talk about, because they don't often get a chance to just speak in that kind of really heart-connected way to what they're seeing around them and what they see in their day-to-day jobs. And so it's really really powerful. So I think objects help us to tell powerful stories, and that's been the same across all the collections I've worked with around the world.
That's quite incredible, isn't it? That this very, very ordinary thing that we're so used to confronting when we go to the doctor or something can suddenly be tied to this huge narrative. And I mean, so obviously there's been a huge amount of, as you mentioned at the start of the year, Australia was hit by unbelievable fires and heat. And people are experiencing this around the globe. As you said, you originally were going to these communities in the Pacific where you saw very directly that people were being affected by climate change, I guess rising sea levels and increasing temperatures. As people are beginning to experience these things in a much more direct sense, and it's not just a scientific hypothesis or anything like that, it is a very, very real condition that is affecting humans around the earth. How are you engaging with that sense of, that kind of oppressive sense of climate change, but also trying to find some positives, find some, I suppose, get towards the actions and the solutions, and what exactly does climate action mean for museums and for your work?
Yeah, that goes to the heart of a lot of what we're working through at the moment, as we're trying to develop our new big initiatives around what we're going to do around climate outreach. So I think it's important for people to understand the extent of the problem we're facing. We have, in Australia, we have apparently, according to recent research, the third highest rate of climate denialism in the world. That's after the US and apparently Sweden. I'm not sure about those results, but anyway, we are really high in terms of levels of denialism. And that's partly, it's a big media issue that we're struggling against here. But we do need people to understand that this isn't just natural, set of changes we're looking at here. We don't normally get droughts like this. We don't normally get heat and bushfire and bleaching and sea level rise like this in any normal sense, and that we need people to understand that this is human induced serious problems. So we do need to be real about it, and as a museum we need to make sure we're giving people the facts and that we're telling people what the situation is, but at the same time it needs to never ever be just that. We need to always say, this is really serious, we're heading towards this. If we don't take action, what we need to do right now is, as many of us as possible need to step up and really get on board with this very exciting, amazing opportunity we have, this generation and the generations coming after us, to make an incredible difference, to create a world which is so much better. Not only would we reduce the impacts of climate change, which are devastating, but also less pollution, stronger communities, more resilient ecosystems because we're not stuffing them up. All sorts of things that we can achieve which make the planet not just livable, but actually a place where you'd actually really want to live in, and a more just and equitable society in so many ways. So we really want to excite people about the potentials and all those exciting opportunities that they have as individuals, as groups, as businesses, as citizens. And we just want people to be able to understand, because there's a bit of a gap. I don't know about other places, but certainly in Australia, there's a gap between all the solutions that are out there, whether they're technological things to do with energy and transport, and there's biotech, amazing things happening, and the sorts of things we can do, which within our reach, with regenerating forests and wetlands and protecting these places, and building stronger, more resilient communities, and all these wonderful share networks and community gardens and all these things, and really tapping into First Nations knowledge and really just listening and learning from the people who know what we need to do. And that there's all that out there, but there's this huge gap, and the media, well, I guess it's the media's not picking up on it when there's some new discovery, or not necessarily picking up on the stories. The Guardian Australia does a brilliant job, and it's a sort of voice in the wilderness. We need to help fill in that gap. We need to tell more of those really exciting stories about what scientists and developers and biotech people and all these people in the community are doing, and just help people understand that they can get on board with that too, and that they can really help to roll these solutions out. As Greta says, we have the solutions. We just need to make them happen. Yeah, just need to roll them out. So,
do you think some of the narratives around mitigation, adaptation are too limiting in that respect? Because it does, the way you're describing it, and the way that I would agree with you, it is about creating a much better, the possibility of creating a better world. And
exactly.
That message is not often part of the discourse, it seems.
Right. Yeah.
And the role of museums in communicating that, I'm not sure people have started to investigate. I suppose because they've been seen as institutions of the past rather than helping to shape the future. But that's changing a lot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think you're right, and certainly looking at how museums have stepped up to their responsibilities to the present and the future is something that's only been happening in the last 10 years. I know Robert Janes has done lots of work on really trying to help museums understand that responsibility, and he and others have been speaking to this much more, and I think that's helped. But also, I suppose, seeing that another museum is stepping up. So when you see like the Natural History Museum in London, which people have tended to see as maybe a really old, historic and probably very traditional museum, is actually now saying that their whole mission is to create advocates for the planet. And they're doing it. They're just out there doing it. They're really being very innovative and doing something which is bold. You know, that's really out there, and a lot of people would be uneasy about saying that their museum was doing anything to do with advocacy or helping other people to become advocates. It seems, especially because many of us have political, we have government funding. There's often an uneasiness about doing anything which might be seen as being political advocacy or advocacy for action which, you know, translates as political. And so it's just really great to see the Natural History Museum taking a lead, and other big institutions in places like, you know, case of the States and in Europe are doing the same kind of thing. And recently, all the natural history museums in Australia banded together and created a joint statement. It was after the fires, and there was a lot of argy-bargy in the press about, oh, well, you know, it was a lot of these fires were lit by arsonists, and, you know, Australia gets hot anyway, you know, all that sort of thing. And so all the natural history museums banded together and they put out a joint statement, which was put in one of our the more conservative newspapers, which was a good strategic win for the group that was doing this statement, led by Kim McKay. And they were able to say it's really important that everyone recognises that the bushfires were part of the new landscape that climate change has created, and museums are doing everything they can to help with the effort to educate, to get people engaged, and to also fight, sort of bounce back to some extent from the fires. You do the research that needs to be done to see what impacts that have been had on the environment, and use those collections that we have, which provide some baselines to the way things were before and, you know, how they've been over time. We can use our collections, we use our expertise, and use our capacity for outreach to really help respond to the bushfires. And we will keep doing that with every new natural disaster, every new disaster that comes because of climate change. And yeah, so that was a really bold thing to do. And I think more and more museums, as they hear other museums say those kinds of things, are probably going to be more willing to start stepping up.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned the Natural History Museum in London there, because I was extremely excited by their declaration of the planetary emergency. I think that was the start of this year, which seems like an eternity ago. Right?
I know. It was in January. Yeah, they did it in January.
And I know they've got they're going to be doing a lot of work around the Anthropocene and extinction and those kinds of issues. I must say though that then you see these systemic changes that are perhaps needed to enact some of those ideas, where they then appoint the director of Amazon UK as their new director, which is an unusual decision, but we won't get too political in this conversation around that. But one of the other kind of changes that I think that museums recognise they need to enact, and you've certainly written about this bit, but they're perhaps not quite clear on how they need to get there, is around moving beyond Western knowledge systems and moving beyond actually the knowledge systems that museums have been part of since they emerged in a kind of 16th century, 16th, 17th century, along with the Enlightenment. Museums have been part of a certain knowledge system that now seems inappropriate or somehow part of the problem in a way. And I'm wondering how you see that shift, and actually how do you engage with that really, really big question mark around what is a museum and why should we care about them in this certain time?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, good one. So that's absolutely essential to be really getting our teeth into. I mean, and all my First Nations colleagues at the Australian Museum keep saying, I mean, they're doing everything they can, but we're still working within this extremely colonial institution, and it is really hard within these structures to get anything to change other than very slowly. And well, so there are other museums who are doing it quickly, and we've got places that have been built as bicultural institutions from the start, like Te Papa Tongarewa in Wellington, New Zealand, and many other institutions that have set themselves up deliberately to be capable of reflecting First Nations perspectives, or many, many different cultural perspectives. And I think cultural centres are actually a really good model. And I know when people have talked to me about, oh, well, I think we should set up a museum here in, in our island, somewhere in the Pacific, I've said, well, museum maybe, or what about, thinking through a cultural centre that actually is a place where anyone in the community is going to feel comfortable coming, where it's all about sharing stories and histories and ancestries and taonga, treasures and all sorts of things that are actually really important to you in your community. And I think what's happening now in places like the Australian Museum is that we're making a slow but really concerted effort to make sure that there are sufficient voices within the museum to guide our new mission and to keep us alert all the time to learning from our colleagues who have the perspectives we really need to tap into and really understand. And we're appointing more First Nations people. So our next appointment is going to be a First Nations executive member, so a member of the executive team who will then have oversight over the cultural collections, and there'll be other people. So there's more. We need more and more staff within the museum who are First Nations, who are able to help us know how to do things in the right kinds of ways. And we're also we know ourselves that what we need to do is to get outside of the institution, and we need to just get out much more into communities. And so if I'm taking forward a big new initiative on reaching people on climate change, I know absolutely I can't stay inside the museum to do that. I'm going to have to go out to Western Sydney, and I'm going to have to go out to Orange and Dubbo and Wagga Wagga and on all these places, way out there, or way up on the coast, who don't normally come to our museum, certainly, or museums really ever, because it's not really something that speaks to them. And so we need to figure out what speaks to those people and how to connect to them, what matters to them, how we can understand what their world of significance is, and that's people of all sorts of communities. So it'll be the First Nations communities, it'll be migrant communities, it'll be all sorts of rural communities who've been there for generations, and it's understanding that we as a museum need to learn from other people. We need to learn. I mean, I don't know what's going to connect to a lot of these people. I need to learn. So I think, and that's the same for many of my colleagues around the world. We all need to just be listening. Actually, we need to do a lot more listening, so we know what information people want, if they want any, and what stories they want to share with others. So I think that's the important thing museums need to do.
Do you get any sense that actually, this seems like an odd thing to say, but that actually climate change has made some of those conversations easier in a way? Because suddenly there's this shared sense of vulnerability, precarity, and understanding that I think one of the things that climate change has done for me is to understand how entangled histories are so, you just cannot get away from the entanglement of nature and culture. You cannot get away from the entanglement of certain historical narratives, and objects allow you to see those entanglements, and they allow you to draw all these stories together. And I don't know, do you think that slightly paradoxically climate change has made some of that work easier in a way?
Yeah, maybe it has. That's a really good thing. That's a really good thought. I like that. I think
it's a shared problem.
A shared problem. Yeah, that makes sense. Actually, you're absolutely right.
Very differently across lots of different communities, but
yeah,
I don't know.
It's right. Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and it also it gives an urgency to the need to work together, which that can only be a good thing, because we all know that it's only collective effort that's going to help us get through this, and that we need to work together as museums, and we need to work together as people in Sydney and people in Australia, and it's really and people all around the world. And so we really do need to recognize that sense of the shared crisis means a shared solution, shared efforts, shared working together to try and upscale what it is that we can achieve. Yeah.
I mean, well, one of the things that got me thinking in that direction actually was one of the projects you were involved in, I think, in New York, where you brought together communities from, was it Fiji?
Samoa.
Yeah, with communities who had just been affected by a hurricane in New York. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because I thought that's fascinating.
Yeah, that was a really amazing project. So we called it Rethinking Home, and so we were able to link up with the Museum of Samoa. It was through a grant that enabled museums to work together, and so it was American Alliance of Museums, and they gave money to a sort of a host, or a sort of a central museum in America, to then link with another museum somewhere else in the world. And so I thought, this is a great opportunity actually to really explore what the impacts are of dealing with the kinds of massive disasters that have been hitting the Pacific and New York. So we had Hurricane Sandy, and then Hurricane Evan, also Cyclone Evan, hit Samoa, and really close together. And I thought I was really noticing in some of the people around me in New York was those who had lost their homes, or who, had had major damage to their homes, had really lost a major sense of their security and safety of all sorts. And I thought, I wonder if the sorts of reactions that you see here in New York, and the ways that people were responding, are similar in Samoa, or whether, because of the different cultural resources they have there, there's very different responses, and whether people lose that very fundamental sense of security and connection to place that had happened in New York. And Lemepa Apelu, who is the director of the Museum of Samoa, was really interested in the ideas, and so we got together and we arranged for a group of mostly young people in Samoa, and it was a very mixed age group actually in New York, just come in as volunteers, and we connected up a bit online initially, but and in each place we had different conversations about the impacts of these cyclones on people's lives. We shared the stories between, and we had funding to actually bring a few people from each place to the other, and so then we had more workshops together and sharing of experiences and stories, and we took people from Samoa to see impacts in Staten Island and that sort of thing. And then we took some young people from New York to Samoa and to see some of the impacts there. And we really found that in Samoa, people look after each other in the kind of way that means that no one's ever alone, and they're never homeless or without food, without emotional support. And people bounce back very quickly from the sorts of experiences that they are often having there. Whereas in New York, there's, of course, people do come together, but there's more of a hesitancy. I think often when people were seeing water rushing up their street, they didn't, and about to flood them massively, they didn't really know whether they could go and ask their neighbour for some help or not, because they'd never really talked to the neighbour before, and it was just a very different context. In Samoa, you have the anga, which is like the extended family, and the anga is the support network for every single person. And although some people might feel that there's like a little bit too much togetherness sometimes, it's the thing is that it means that they have a lot of resilience. There's a lot of resilience there, and a lot of support for each other. It by no means means that we in the global north need to assume that everyone in Samoa is fine. It doesn't mean that we've got any out on our responsibilities to for heaven's sakes, just stop burning fossil fuels and just, do everything we possibly can to make it more possible for those people to stay in their ancestral homes, because people can be resilient only for so long, really. Mm.
It's interesting to hear you speak about, I mean, that kind of role and that kind of activity and that kind of engagement work is obviously central to what museums do now. It's really important to their missions. But I don't think it's what people typically think of museums as, like bringing together these communities, responding to this particular environmental threat. Actually, it's not specifically collecting, it's not curating as such. It is very much about community building, cohesion, sharing, social well-being, I suppose you might call it in some way. And one of the things I've certainly noticed, and I think it's really important to draw out that idea that certain parts of the world are much more atomized, and our sense of self and community has been eroded by different economic practices and social practices and whatever. But certainly over the past few months, the area of London that I live in, I'm just around the corner from the Horniman Museum.
Oh, very good. Yes.
And that has been a real lifesaver for the community. It has a huge garden, it has beautiful, beautiful areas, and they have stayed open throughout the whole of the coronavirus period, pretty much. And it has become like an absolute hub for the entire community. And it's just been wonderful to have this on our doorstep and to know that it's being managed and cared for by people who are really, they have fantastic expertise in ecosystems management. So they've been looking after the trees and the grasses and everything, and they've implemented a new bee house. And then also becomes this community place where everyone comes together at the end of the day, because we can't go to the pub because we're British and that's what we normally do. So we go to the park instead. But it's interesting to speak about that idea that museums might have a role to play in bringing together those shared communities in a broader sense in response to climate change. Yeah.
It's a different kind of role. I think Nick Merriman, who's the director of the Horniman, has recently just put out a statement, speaking to these kinds of points. I think.
He has, yeah.
Step up to these responsibilities. I think museums can, and we've got this amazing sort of license to do all sorts of incredible things. I mean, we could sort of define ourselves, can't we? What it is that we do in the community, and we don't have to be completely defined by our walls and our collections. I must admit that the Samoan New York project was still grounded in some objects, because we were really looking at, in the material at least, grounded in the material, because we were looking at houses and homes and the traditional whale in Samoa and how it was changing in response to climate change and what was happening in New York as well. So we still did have it grounded in materiality, but I think if we're wanting, I guess if we're really focusing on our missions, and if our missions are becoming much more attendant to social and environmental justice, then our programs just sort of follow suit in whatever way works best. And so if it's going out and running, workshops to create beautiful leaves reflecting regeneration after the bushfires through, in a bunch of schools in rural New South Wales, then that's what we should do, rather than thinking that a museum needs to do a particular kind of work. And I think there's a lot of scope. Yeah, there's a lot of scope for museums. It's a really exciting moment for museums, I think, that they're really.
I agree.
Yeah. And I think it's the fact that more museums are hiring or appointing curators of the Anthropocene, as they have at the Carnegie in Pittsburgh, and as the Natural History Museum has, with appointing Camilla. I think it's, I've just forgotten her surname. It's terrible.
Is it Camilla Tan?
Thank you very much. It is, yes. Camilla Tan. Just saw it the other day. And yes, sorry to have a mental blank there, but she's wonderful and doing incredibly good work there, and really pulling together people from all around the world who are working in this space. And so it's an exciting moment, and that there's people like Henry McGee, who was at the Manchester Museum and has now got his own consultancy, Curating Tomorrow, and he's getting a lot of work, really helping people to think about what are we doing as museums, and how are we actually going to prepare ourselves or really fit ourselves to help create the futures we want to live in. And Henry does a lot of great work with helping us use the UN Global Goals, so the Sustainable Development Goals, something that museums are increasingly thinking about and stepping up to. And Henry's running a session for us at the, well, it's online tomorrow for a lot of the institutions here in Sydney, a lot of the cultural institutions. And so it's that sort of seeing that museums are really thinking about what their role is in the world, and how they can, you know, do that really idealistic but kind of necessary thing of thinking about how do we make this better world that we can actually survive in and thrive in. Yeah.
I mean, that ties into my last question, actually. You've said that museums enable processes that support the creation of imagined futures, which I think is what we're kind of talking about there, which is obviously something that the competition is trying to achieve. How do we actually use museums as a tool to think very differently about the future in a climate change era, and the museum as climate action? What exactly do you want to see coming out of the competition? What would be your, I suppose, not what would you submit, but what are you kind of excited to see other people submit?
Oh, I'm so excited. Yes, I think it's going to be amazing, creative efflorescence, and it's going to be really amazing seeing what comes from different parts of the world, because I mean, I don't have much access to what it is that people in Russia or China or India have imagined about what they can see coming out of museums towards, you know, creating sort of futures that they would like to see. And I think it's going to be really eye-opening, and it'll help, I guess, just expand all our horizons if we can see all these really different ways of approaching the problems that are facing us. And I think seeing different ways of using museums and using exhibits and the sorts of ways of reaching people innovatively in more innovative ways that will come out from these very different cultural approaches, I think is going to be completely fascinating. Yeah, I can't wait to see.
Well, I mean, that's obviously work that you've been driving forward and leading on, and now we'll see what people around the world, how they respond to it, I guess.
Great, I hope so. I don't know many people of you have tapped into what I'm doing particularly, but I think there's things that I'm involved in which are really, they're big group things, but they're really, I think, yeah, they think they really help. And they're things like, the Museums and Climate Change Network is a place where, so it's an online network, but it really helps knowing that there's a lot of other people out there in the world working in museums. They're small museums, or they're students who are museum students, and they're big museums, and it's all these people working in all these many different ways, and getting an insight into what they're doing, and sharing the challenges and the successes and the resources that they've created really helps. Actually, it means that you're being you're stepping up this ladder of upskilling and inspiration to reach, better heights. So it's I think these things are important. Really being able to tap into what other people are doing. Yeah, and there's
I was just going to say it was a nice point to end on, but if you have a
no, that's good. There's so many more things I could say.
I was going to say, I'll put links to all of these things, because you've mentioned a lot of different projects and a lot of different initiatives, which I think it'd be really good to highlight to people. So I'll embed links in the video, or put links under the video somewhere. Yeah,
that's a good idea. And I like to flag up for people, if they haven't already read Christiana Figueres and Tom Rivett-Carnack's book, which is The Future We Choose. Do read it. It is amazing and wonderful and really important in terms of doing that work of helping people to imagine a positive future, and really helping them to recognise that it's something we can work towards and we should be working towards. So that's a good one. Also 2040, for the same reasons. 2040, the movie, there's also a really great book that goes with it. So this is from an Australian filmmaker called Damon Gameau.
I've seen the trailer for this, yeah.
Yeah, good. Do try and see it. It's funny, sometimes a bit cheesy, but mostly just awesome. So it's just great, because he uses all the solutions that are around us now, all the technologies and ideas that are around us now, and just says, what if we actually just ran with them? What could we achieve? And what could we achieve by 2040? And it's amazing what we can achieve. So there we are. When my 9-year-old saw that film, he said, "Mummy, I have hope for the future now."
Oh, that's a nice point to end on. There we go. Well,
that's what museums can do. Museums can do that too.
Thank you very
Thanks
much, Jenny. That was a great chat. Thank you.